Eric Wahlberg is an author and journalist and joins us now. Eric, welcome. We have a situation here where the most sensitive site in Israel, where it stores its nuclear weapons, has almost been hit by a missile from Syria. Uh, Tell us your views, the significance of this development, a major development in West Asia.
Well, my first thought is, first of all, Russia and its S-400s are protecting Syria now. I think Russia's beginning to take a little bit more of a proactive stance after Israel's continual bombing, which Russia has said openly that we will not allow this to continue. So that I don't know if there's any play on the Russian side. The other thing is this Iron Dome. What is this Iron Dome that is supposed to protect Israel? Should it have a steel dome instead of an iron dome? I think that is an incredible move that Syria was able to get through this supposedly invincible air protection and hit the most sensitive site in Israel. It's quite astounding.
Right, indeed it is. And Eric, the missile was launched from Syria, but it does come amid tensions with Iran, between Israel and Iran, following a series of terror attacks by Israel against Iran that Iran accuses Israel of conducting. The latest being the act of sabotage against Iran's facility in Natanz. US media are alluding that there may be some Iranian involvement in this attack against a site very close to the Dimona, where nuclear weapons are stored by Israel. What's your views on the possible links between these two?
Well, to me, that is nonsense. To immediately, it's the same story in the days of the Soviet Union. No matter what happened anywhere in the world, it was a Russian, it was a Soviet attack, it was Soviet conspiracy. They're playing the same game now with Iran. So in a way, it really shows how powerful and credible Iran is now. That if Israel and the U.S. can attribute the most incredible events to Iran, that's quite a feather in Iran's cap. It's really, in a way, also Israel's so busy attacking Iran now, assassinating and bombing, and all of a sudden Syria, out of the blue, blasts Israel. So I think maybe this will be a little bit of a wake-up call to Israel to stop all of its conspiracies and killings and assassinations. Let's hope breathe a little bit of common sense into this very unpredictable world nation.
Right. I mean, Eric, we haven't heard anything from Iranian officials yet. They haven't confirmed nor denied any involvement in this attack. Yet all we're hearing is from Israeli and U.S. media citing sources. We don't know who the sources are, that Iran could be behind this. Iran did vow to retaliate against Israel because it did accuse Israel, the regime, of being behind the terror attack against its own peaceful nuclear facility, Natanz. And that we do know that there are also, Iranian military advisors in Syria. Having said that, what do you think of that?
Well, it is a good parallel here. Israel attacks Iran's nuclear facilities, peaceful facilities, and a week later, Israel its nuclear weapons center, Dimona, it's not peaceful. It's got lots of nuclear weapons stored there. Is a I don't know who did it. If it's an act of God or if it's Syrians really getting their act together and making use of all their Russian and Iranian assistance. I think that. Well, I don't know. As you say, Iran has made no comment so far, but I think this is also a wake-up call for Biden. Get this JCPOA back into action immediately, and then the U.S. can have some leverage. Now it's got no leverage. The U.S. is helpless because it doesn't want to. At least the U.S. is not openly. The U.S. under Biden is not open in destroying Iran, and it's a little bit more civilized than Israel or than the Trump White House. So I think Iran's in a good position now that it really is up to the U.S. to get its act together and to get back into play in a way that it can temper its obstreperous Israeli wild cannon. And so I think that this, my feeling is that this is a positive development. I don't know who did it, but it's a good wake-up call for the actors that are acting way behind today in world politics.
Eric, this explosion comes one day after another explosion hits what Israel, the officials admit, was a very sensitive missile factory. It's one event after the other. Do you see this as perhaps the beginning of a possible swing in West Asia, where before, the era of hit and run is over, as they say, that if you hit us, which Israel has been conducting terrorist attacks on an almost weekly basis against Syria, it violates Lebanese airspace. It's been reported to have been involved in attacks in Yemen. It's reported to have been involved in attacks in Iraq. It's occupied the Golan. It commits daily violations against the Palestinians. And then we're seeing these developments occurring. You got yesterday an explosion, today another explosion. Some even, I've been reading, multiple explosions near the Natanz facility. Do you see this as a swing in developments in West Asia?
I don't know. It's very upsetting to see that subversion, so much sabotage going on within Iran that is directly, it's Israeli inspired. So I don't know if they're on a roll, if they're going to be able to keep this up. At least the Dimona strike put a little bit of fear into them, I hope. But I don't know. It's really up to the U.S. to move in. The U.S. has been has had no role, has really had no role in the Middle East since Trump was elected. It's basically done everything for Israel. That's it. So now this JCPOA, it looks like even Israel is saying we're resigned to the JCPOA. They're very upset in their Times of Israel commentary. So it looks like the spoiled brat is finally stopping his tantrum. That's what I hope. I don't know. Children are unpredictable. Perhaps he will keep Israel will keep screaming and yelling and doing its craziness. It really is up to the U.S. now to step in and try and cool the situation off, and that's what we really have to look to now. It's not really a problem. Iran is the victim here. Syria is the victim. Israel's had a little bit of and now it's time to bring Israel into line. Maybe this is a good time for Biden to step in and do something.
Okay, Eric, stay. Let me. Thanks for that. Stay with me. Let me see if Robert Fantina,
Okay.
author and journalist, is with us. Robert, welcome. Robert, what's your take on this? That's not Robert. That's Frank Emspack. Hello, Frank.
Yeah. Hi.
Hey, hi, Frank. How are you doing? What's your take on this, Frank?
Well, I mean, the headlines like everybody else, but today in the New York Times and yesterday there were articles about people who are very, very interested in undoing any attempt to have the United States return to the accords with Iran. And the question ultimately comes down to who is making policy, the Israelis or the United States, and is Israel making policy for the United States? And I think that there is every person, I won't say every person, but many, many people observing in the Middle East think that Israel will go to almost any lengths to undermine, prevent, derail, or in any way screw up any kind of possible rapprochement between Iran and the United States, that it's a fundamental issue. For a country like Israel to have continually attacked Iran, which in any other context, we, the United States, would be up in arms about, and now we're silent, indicates that, in fact, that the Israelis are doing these things to destroy the accords. And at this moment in the United States, I think the issue is in balance.
Frank, it's a very important point you raised. If we just expand on that for a little while, do you see that whenever Israel tries to commit acts of terrorism against Iran, and when it does commit acts of terrorism against Iran, do you think the knowledge of the United States, does it not get the green light of the United States? And if not,
I don't think the Israelis are waiting for a green light. You know, you can ask permission, or you can ask for, you can ask first, right, and do something. Why ask first? You can always get absolution later. And so I don't think it's necessary to assume that that Israel calls up the CIA or somebody and says, hey, can we do this? I think that there are forces in the United States that have been very clear. They're in the newspaper. They say we should not have an approachment with Iran. You have a major funders of the Republican Party, of course, he just died, Abelson, but a whole group to any kind of arrangement with Iran. Then you've had a policy for many, many years where the United States government has turned a blind eye to whatever Israel is doing. So why ask? I think what's significant about the last couple of weeks is that the United States would have had an opportunity over the last week, particularly to say, we don't think extrajudicial killings or attacks on other countries are a good thing to do. And they could have responded to the recent issue with Iran, where Israel apparently has blown up or did whatever they did to the Iranians in the last couple of weeks. I think that was an opportunity that was lost. Situation that's extraordinarily dangerous. And I believe that the only way that this is going to work out ultimately is if the American government makes it clear that we, the United States, are not interested in resuming hostilities in the Middle East. That we have to say, we have to give some leadership here. And I believe that there are pressures within the administration to say we should work something out with Iran. And there are strong pressures both within the Democratic and Republican Party against that.
So if that's the case, Frank, then how vulnerable does that leave Israel and its staunchest ally, the United States in West Asia? Because when Israel attacks, responds, albeit at a time and a place of its choosing.
If we have that kind of war, I have absolutely no idea how vulnerable people are. I mean, you have a country that has nuclear weapons here, then in the form of Israel. You have a country that's a very large country. a very well-armed country and with serious defensive capability and offensive capability in terms of Iran. If there is a war between the two, it would be an absolute tragedy, disaster, and I don't think would necessarily be contained. I think the theory that many people have, you can have this sort of tit for tat thing, is absolutely crazy. It has never worked out that way, and so I think at this point, the Europeans and those forces in the United States who think that there should be a treaty, as I do, obviously, need to be able to say to the Biden administration, time is to sit down. We have interests, the United States has interests that are not the Israeli interests. We have interests as a country to work out an arrangement with Iran. And the reason is that by having this treaty is the only way in which nuclear proliferation is going to be prevented. That's clear. So for that, we have to take the steps to move forward.
So, Frank, what you're saying is that Israel, with its some estimates say 400 nuclear, is taking these actions without the green light from Washington.
I don't think they need it, and I don't think the Israeli government is looking for it. They're looking for absolution later, or they're looking for us to, as we have, look the other way when these things happen. The problem is that these are all methods that are extraordinarily destabilizing of the situation, and no country is going to sit around and get itself attacked time and time again without doing anything, because here in this country, I don't think there's much understanding that there's an Iranian country with politics and with people, just like here, that are saying, no, enough's enough. And I believe within Iran are also serious in the sense that they could also convince the Iranian government or the Iranian people that, hey, we just can't tolerate this. And so we here in the United States need to understand and appreciate that and work, as far as I'm concerned, with those portions of the world that are going to say we need a treaty and we need to do it now, whatever the Israelis have to say.
Frank, thank you very much indeed for that. Frank M. Speck there, Emeritus Professor at the University of Wisconsin, joining us out of Madison. Let's cross over to Kitchener, joined there by Robert Fantino, the author and the journalist. Robert, welcome. What do you make of this? Has Israel been exposed to an extent that it has never been exposed before?
It appears that it might have been what these rockets coming close to their one of their nuclear sites. I think also it was very accurate what your other commentators said about Israel not needing or wanting permission from the United States. Israel has learned over the years, the Israeli government has learned that whatever it does, the United States will support. It doesn't matter how atrocious the violation of human rights is. It doesn't matter how serious the violation of international law, the United States will support it completely. But as you mentioned, this recent attack makes or demonstrates Israel's vulnerability no longer protect itself to the degree that it thought it could or that it told the world it could. So this recent rocket attack may be a harbinger of things to come.
Robert, we haven't seen any yet. There hasn't been any, comments from Iran regarding this. There hasn't been any statements issued. We've heard the sources we're seeing sources in Israeli media as well as U.S. media citing their own sources, anonymous sources, that Iran perhaps is involved, had a role in this operation. Do you see any possible links as this on the backdrop of the attack on Iran's, nuclear facility?
Yes, so there could be a link. There may not be, but there could certainly be. However, we have to remember that the United States did not condemn Israel for the attack on Iran's facility, but now the United States is going to be horrified that Iran might have retaliated. This one-sided attitude is not justice. It isn't anything to do with what's fair, what's right, or what's just. Whether or not Iran was involved in any way really doesn't matter. But the rockets came from Syria. Iran are allies, and Iran is assisting Syria in fighting off U.S.-supported terrorists that are looking for so-called regime change there. But the United States will demonize Iran every chance it gets. So a rocket coming from Syria to Israel, which may have had nothing to do with Iran, will be seen by spokespeople from the U.S. government as coming from Iran, as the responsibility of Iran, and as additional evidence of Iran's terrorist activities. No one said anything about the attack from Israel against Iran as a terrorist activity. So we have this dual conversation here, this dialogue that is very, very typical of the United States.
And Robert, how do you foresee the future? You had an era a decade or two ago, where you had an axis, Israel and the like, that had the upper hand in the region. You could say, they violated the Palestinians' rights. They could violated Lebanese rights. They violated Syria, and so on and so forth. And on the other side, you have another axis, an axis of resistance, that are resisting the monarchies in the region, that are, violating and waging wars on. Do you see a shift in balance here?
I think there is a major shift. Israel has trampled over the rights of people throughout the Middle East for a long time, and people are tired of it. Although some governments of Arab nations have recently established alliances with Israel, those alliances are not in keeping with what the people of those countries want. So we're going to see more resistance there. The people of Palestine are getting more international support. That's happening even in the United States, where survey after survey shows that people support Palestine and condemn Israel, but that hasn't filtered up to the government yet, although it is starting to. More instability throughout the Middle East as Israel continues to run roughshod over every nation there, and the other nations start saying, enough. We have sufficient power. We can resist. We don't have to tolerate these violations of our airspace, of our ground space, of our rights as sovereign nations, simply because Israel wants to be the only powerful country in the Middle East. So there will be more resistance. There will be more aggression against Israel. This will justify the United States in increasing its military aid to Israel, which is a crime in and of itself. But there's been, I think, a turning point. People are tired of this. People throughout the Middle East, they're tired of playing second-class citizens to Israel, and they're tired of being pawns in U.S. wars. And we're reaching the point where they've had enough.
Robert, just finally, I just go back to the Natanz incident, which Iran accused Israel of, and other incidents of the sort and the like, and Israel's violations, its attacks on other countries, on attacking their sovereignty and violating their sovereignty. So do you see the era of hit and run by Israel as over? And then just a follow-up question to that is that Israel goes ahead with these attacks without, doesn't need the green light from Washington, despite the fact that Washington is providing Israel with, up to the tune of, $4 billion of U.S. taxpayers' money in military aid. Does that not, with Israel going ahead, plotting in the region, committing terror attacks without the green light from Washington, does that not, push the United States further to end its hegemony in the region? Does that not backfire on the United States?
supporting a nation, Israel, that is slowly losing power, although it seems to be accelerating. Israel, for a long time, was untouchable. No other country would dare to send rockets into it except Palestine. But this Syria rocket attack is something we haven't seen a lot of that. Israel's retaliations, we haven't seen a lot of that. We're seeing more and more of it. So as the United States continues to allow Israel to do whatever it wants in that part of the world and finances it, it only compromises Israeli security, which is what Benjamin Netanyahu and the other leaders of Israel are always saying is in danger. So their actions are putting their country in the country of Israel in danger. The United States continues to support it with increased military aid, which enables Israel to continue its violent incursions into other countries, which only causes more hostility within countries that are growing more and more powerful. So this does backfire completely. And it will take a long time, unfortunately, for people in the U.S. government to recognize that.
And just how do you think just very quickly in the 1 or 2 minutes that we have left, Robert, how do you think the view of the Biden administration would be towards this kind of policy by Israel?
The Biden administration will continue to support Netanyahu. Has proudly admitted that he's a Zionist. So has Vice President Harris. This is not going to change from them. There is increasing pressure from the progressive wing of the Democratic Party to make a change. But right now there is so much going on in the United States domestically that that this is not going to take a dominant position on the U.S.'s agenda. It's unfortunate for the world, but that's the way it is.
Okay, Robert Fantina, thank you very much indeed for that. Robert, the author and journalist, joining us out of Kitchener.